Okay, are we ready? Thanks. Okay, Annabelle. Great. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that we welcome them in your name? Thank you very much. Can I just say what a pleasure it is to be back in Cardiff after an embarrassingly long period of time. And I've had a lovely afternoon looking at the museum and admiring the buildings around here. So thank you for your hospitality. Minutes.
The minutes of the ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London on Thursday, 23rd of February 2023, held in Burlington House, London, and online. Sir Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The President thanked those fellows who had attended the strategic review briefing which took place earlier that day. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, 16th of February 2023 were read and signed. The following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes were duly admitted fellow: Ross Cook, Peter Klitgart. The following communication was then laid before the Society, shedding new light on an old treasure, re-examining the Iron Age hoards from Snettisham North by Dr. Julia Farley, FSA, and Dr. Jodie Joy, FSA. Thanks were returned for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be on Thursday, March 2nd, 2023 in Cardiff, then adjourned the meeting. A reception followed.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Just to remind fellows that as we have changed the system for dealing with nominations for fellowship, we now no longer read the list of blue papers that have been submitted at ordinary meetings. These are available through the Society's website where they can be consulted and you can then take part in the ballot. We now come to the main business of this evening's meeting, which is to hear a paper from our fellow Dr. Andy Seaman. Andy was appointed as a lecturer here at Cardiff University in early medieval archaeology in February 2022. Prior to this, he worked at Canterbury Christchurch University, where he established and led the very successful, I must say, archaeology degree over the last 10 years. He trained at Cardiff and also worked in professional archaeology. He's a specialist in late antique and early medieval Western Britain and is engaged in a number of projects, including those funded by the AHRC and the Leave Hume Trust. He's led a number of fieldwork projects, mainly in South Wales, including excavations at Dinas Powys, Southern Banks, and Mount St Albans near Caerleon. He's currently completing a monograph on the reoccupation of hill forts in the late and post-Roman Western Britain. So we welcome Andy, who is going to speak to us this evening on the title, Fonmon Castle Landscape Archaeology Project, results from the first 2 years of survey and excavation. Welcome, Andy. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and speaking to you this evening. Okay, what I'm going to do in this lecture is introduce the project that we've been doing for a couple of years now and talk through some of the initial results, which sort of get more exciting by each radiocarbon date, and then sketch out some plans for the future. So for those of you who don't know the area, this is Fonmon, so in the eastern Vale of Glamorgan, sandwiched between a quarry, airport, and RAF airbase. But a very interesting place. In terms of the castle, it is in origin a late 12th century, we think, ringwork with a stone tower keep, which has been sort of encapsulated within a very long history of building and rebuilding on this site. There may have been an earlier timber phase, but we don't know much about that. The castle is the manor of one of the 4 sub-fees of the Norman Lordship of Penmark. And it's interesting because it's been occupied continuously since it was constructed. And that has led to this very interesting and complex structure. And it's also interesting that until 2019, the castle and the estate had been held by just two families. And the third person to hold it is in the audience with us, Nigel, there. But this is all I really want to say about the castle, because I am not a late medieval archaeologist. I am a specialist in the early medieval period, the 600 or 700 years or so before the construction of the castle. So when I was invited to see if I would be interested in doing some work on the site, I was not overly excited by the prospect of doing Norman period archaeology. But for those of you who know the early medieval period, particularly the early medieval period in Western Britain, you will know that it has extremely ephemeral archaeological record. Really, in terms of the Holocene, it's really only the Mesolithic which has got sort of less archaeologically visible. So I was very intrigued by the possibility of working not necessarily on the castle, but on the demesne lands attached to the castle. And in particular, this sort of 35-hectare area to the west of the castle. Because I think it's an unproven, but perhaps fairly sensible suggestion that if we're trying to find the highly ephemeral archaeology of the early medieval period, it might be wise to start looking at places that were important in the later Middle Ages. So if the castle was put there because there was something there earlier, then it might be a good place to start exploring or trying to explore the early medieval landscape. I was also very interested in working at scale. After many years of doing very small bits of fieldwork, restricted trenches and small surveys, I got very frustrated and not really being able to gather enough data. And it became very evident that if we are going to understand the early medieval period in the west of Britain, we need to do work at scale. So I was very drawn to working on this particular area to the west of the castle. Not least because it's quite strong grounds for suggesting that anything within that area probably has a terminus antiquem of late 12th century, because I think the area was emparked shortly after then. So it sort of bodes well. And archaeologically, this is a very interesting area. So this is from Oliver Davis's recent study of sort of prehistoric earthwork sites in the Vale of Glamorgan. And there is a distinct cluster of known sites known through aerial photography around the confluence of the Kenson and the Fore in this area. So there's a lot of archaeology. And in terms of its early medieval history, the parish to the north, which is Llancarvan, was a focus of early medieval ecclesiastical activity. Jeremy Knight has done some work on this. And indeed, we know from fairly limited aerial photography that there are features within the demesne of the castle. And in fact, there has been some small-scale archaeological work, including an excavation on Castle Wood enclosure by Edith Evans as part of the Romano-British South East Wales Rural Settlement Project. And then you can see on this AP, this is actually from Google Earth, you just make out the sort of partial earthwork enclosure. Well, what's quite interesting is despite the castle being directly below the flight path into Cardiff Airport, it is very rarely flown for archaeological aerial photography. because there's so many aeroplanes, Toby Driver can't actually get over it very often. So it's a sort of tantalizing. Moreover, about some years ago now, I did some work on trying to model where we might start to look for early medieval archaeological sites. And I wrote an article on a predictive model of early medieval settlement location focused on the Vale, and the Castle Domain lands firmly sits within one of my zone 1 most likely places to contain settlement. So again, I was drawn to working there. And another piece of work we did more recently, which was actually focused on Dinas Powys, was to try to understand early routeways through the Vale of Glamorgan. I don't just work on the Vale of Glamorgan, I should say. I do sometimes stray elsewhere. But we were trying to use GIS to model routeways through the landscape, and a number of these routeways converge on the domain of the castle. So there were sort of hints that this might be a good place to start looking for early medieval archaeology. Here is the study area on the survey map. Castle here on to the east, and then it's this sort of large area here now bisected by the Barry Road. Here's a LiDAR, just giving you a sense of the topography. So the ground drops off very steeply to the north into the Kenson Valley, and there's a sort of dry valley running along sort of here, and cut into it by the modern road. Not a great deal of archaeology visible in the LiDAR, though, just fairly modern field boundaries. Here is the earliest known map of the castle domain. And what's interesting from this is that it has barely changed in 400-500 years. The fields are still there. The field boundaries are largely in the same place. So if we go through time, I think this is in the early 19th, late 18th century. This is the Tithe map, first edition Ordnance Survey. And with the exception of the construction of the new road in the 1970s, there hasn't been very much kind of change here. So it's a fairly stable landscape. Here is the domain of the castle as demarcated on this early estate map, 1622 Fonmon estate map. This is an interesting map because it shows the landscape basically at and just after the point of enclosure, when the medieval open fields are starting to be enclosed. I said I wouldn't talk about late medieval archaeology, but we'll have a little bit of indulgence because I think it is important. What we can see here is around Aberfour, down here, you can see the remnants of the medieval open fields, the strips still in place, just been enclosed. And in fact, one is called Northfield and there's a Southfield. It's a sort of classic medieval landscape. But compare that to the castle domain, which is large enclosures, open, down to pasture. There's also a coney acre in there, a rabbit warren. And if you go to it on the ground, which I have done with Chris, it's surrounded by a substantial bank and ditch. And I suspect that what we're seeing here in the domain is an area that was parked as a deer park and attached to the castle, perhaps after the end of domain farming in the 14th century. So perhaps we've got something like this. It's classic devises, got the ring work with attached to it a deer park at the back. In this manuscript illustration, you've got a castle and a deer park at the back. So I very much suspect that that's probably what's going on here at Fonmon, which again means that I think most of the archaeology we'll be seeing in that area is going to be earlier than probably the 14th century, probably earlier than the 12th. So how do we start then trying to explore this landscape? Well, the first thing we decided to do was to undertake an extensive geophysical survey. Had we done this with traditional techniques, handheld instruments, I would still be there now, marching up and down. But we use this as an opportunity to hire a cart-based GPS-linked system, which allows us to survey large areas comparatively quickly, particularly if you have students to push the cart for you. And we were able to basically survey everything that was available to us in a 10-day period just after the pandemic, which was very good for my waistline because I lost a lot of weight, got very fit. But this equipment, I think, is very powerful because it moves us from site geophysics to landscape scale survey, which really does kind of shift the perspective and allow us to see things in a lot more detail. So this is what we were able to survey. The bit in the middle had a crop on it, so we weren't able to do that, but we are going to do that this summer. And you'll see from the scale that it's about 1 kilometre from end to end. So, fairly large area. And pushing the cart from the castle all the way down to the bottom of area 2 was a fun challenge. The instruments, pretty good data quality. They do suffer slightly from sort of a striping effect from tracking, but you get very consistent data, which is nicely synced up with the GPS coordinates. So this is the area 1 that we covered, and you can see we have a series of, there's geological features in here. There's at least 1 Second World War bomb crater in here as well. But there's also quite a lot of archaeology, some of which we knew about previously, others we didn't. So the large egg-shaped enclosure and the smaller subrectangular one next to it were entirely unknown. This is area 2. This is bisected, unfortunately, by the main power line coming from Aberfoyle Power Station, which causes some interference. But again, some of these features we had previously seen through aerial photography, but others were completely new to us. And particularly intriguing, large enclosure here, which appears to sort of fade away as it crosses the power lines, which indeed it also does in the aerial photography, which does suggest it is an incomplete enclosure of some form. Here's the sort of total interpretation of all of the features, including geology and modern things. But this is the archaeology that we think we have within the survey. So this was 9-10 days of surveying, and I think about half a dozen new sites that we hadn't previously known about. And when we fill in the bit in the middle, I very much suspect that that will be filled up as well. I think there will be, certainly Llancadal South 3 extends beyond that field boundary, and that there's going to be more activity there. The features, as you can see, are mainly to the north, close to the valley edge, which nicely supports Edith's suggestion that it's the Coombe edges which are particularly attracted to settlement is particularly attracted to. We've got examples of enclosed and unenclosed settlement. So we've got various kind of enclosures of different forms, different shapes, different sizes, so presumably of different periods. And down here on the far west, some features which could be barrows, but I very much doubt that actually. I think they're likely to be roundhouses. So we've probably got some unenclosed settlement as well. Not much going on the kind of flat plateau. Maybe a trackway coming along here. So quite a successful survey, really. presumably multi-period. And in terms of date, from the report, which is coming out in Archaeology in Wales, but the sort of grey lit report is also being completed. And in that, I sort of hedge my bets, and I say that probably most of what we're looking at is late Iron Age or early Romano-British sort of period, but maybe other periods are possible as well. And it was really with that sort of idea that we're largely dealing with prehistory, because if traditionally we would assume that most of what we're seeing here would be those sorts of sites, that I moved to the next phase of the project, which was small-scale evaluation, which we did last summer. I should say that geophysics was done when I was at Canterbury, and then I transferred to Cardiff, and the excavations was done as one of our sort of summer training excavations. This was very small scale work, and what we were doing was ground truthing, trying to establish if the features that we had seen in the geophysics were real, that they were archaeological. We wanted to assess what we're dealing with in terms of preservation. I had assumed that much of what we're seeing was heavily plough truncated. I had wondered whether this incomplete partial enclosure here was incomplete because the rest of it has been ploughed away. We also wanted to recover some evidence for date and function, and really see if we can establish some sort of research potential. We had planned to dig quite a few more evaluation trenches, and we will need to do a lot more. But the archaeology we encountered was actually a bit more interesting and a bit more complex than we had anticipated. And we only got to complete these 4 trenches, and these are the ones I'll focus on today. So we'll start by looking at trench 1. Just a simple eval trench, bucket width, 15 meters or so long, across this sub-rectangular enclosure, containing an amorphous area of enhanced magnetism, presumably we assumed related to settlement activity, and provisionally interpreted as sort of late Iron Age or early Romano-British settlement enclosure, something like sort of early phases of Witton Roman villa might be a fairly reasonable sort of parallel. So being an early medievalist, I held my nose and prepared to engage in some prehistory. Enclosure ditch, nice. At least 2 phases. In fact, we were very lucky in the sense that we plonked our trench over a terminal of an early phase of the ditch, which you can see here. It narrows down, and that's actually rock cut at the bottom there. And then a later phase has been cut over the top and continues on. About halfway down, a heavy stone layer, which is tumbled in from the inside, presumably derived from bank material. Not very substantial, 1 meter and a bit wide, just under 1 meter deep. But surprisingly, finds rich. And we had quite a lot of animal bone, about 1 kilogram of animal bone from a 2 meter wide slot of a 100 meter long ditch. Provisional, very, very provisional analysis of that suggests we've got sheep, goat, cattle, chicken, and dog. We also had a lead conical spindle well, a iron awl or drill bit, which is close Romano-British or potentially early medieval parallels, and a fair quantity of smithing slag. No pottery at all. So it wasn't entirely unsurprising that radiocarbon dates on animal bone from the earlier phase of the ditch and the later phase of the ditch produced early medieval dates, so calibrating to 7th century or 6th to 7th century. Probably not relevant, but the The earlier phase produced a slightly earlier date than the later phase, but this is only 2 dates, so we shouldn't get too carried away there. And this is quite surprising. If this section that we dug is representative of this enclosure as a whole, then this would be one of the richest early medieval sites in South Wales or Wales, on a par with sort of Llanbedrgoch and Dinas Powys in terms of the quantity of material. We had a kilogram from 2% of the ditch, so we might be looking at something like 50 kilograms from the whole thing. So, and some artifacts, so quite exciting. Not what I thought it would be. Within the, as we cleaned back and this trench went into the enclosure, we encountered some cut features, which initially we had assumed were roundhouse gullies. But as we cleaned these roundhouse gullies, they got straight and 6 foot long and about 1 meter wide. And evidently, we realized they were grave cuts. Within the single trench, there were 4 of these grave cuts, east-west aligned. Interestingly, there were none in the area where the bank would have been, immediately inside of the ditch. We applied for a burial license, which came through quite quickly, and we were able to open just one of these graves. The other ones we left in situ, and we had a fairly decent extended inhumation, head to the west, feet to the east. So the head is looking to the south. Female burial. And for Wales, fairly good preservation. So, you know, this is pretty good bone preservation. And a radiocarbon date on this has produced a date at 2 sigma to 601 to 659. We've hit that one bit of the calibration curve, which is nice and steep. So we've got a very tight date here. So a extended inhumation. And what we have, the reason we initially thought these grave cuts could be roundhouse gullies or some other features is because they were very rich in what could be called occupation debris. There was a lot of animal bone, a lot of charcoal, the odd tiny bit of pottery. Didn't really look like sort of sterile grave fields. And I think that's what we're seeing. This area of enhanced magnetism is not necessarily settlement evidence. It's anthropogenic material within the backfill of the graves. That's why there's no kind of structure to it. It's not resolving itself into buildings or anything like that. So we have, and the radiocarbon date from the grave is a little bit late, as we would expect, is a little bit later than the enclosure. So this is very, very exciting. Didn't expect to find this. Must admit, didn't really hope I would, because that would be being too ambitious. So I was very pleased. We also put a trench across the outer, this Llancadal South A, which we did pick up on the geophysics, but had also been seen previously on aerial photography. Curious monument. Does appear from APs and from geophysics to fade out, to stop, to be incomplete, which poses some interesting questions. What is its relationship to the smaller inner enclosure, the one with the cemetery in it? I would assume the archaeological sequence would be the inner enclosure first and then the outer enclosure around it. It's a little tricky to imagine that you would put something inside of an incomplete kind of defended earthwork. A bit awkward, unless there's no relationship at all between them. And again, we had assumed this would be prehistory. So we put an evaluation trench towards the end on the assumption that perhaps it would be sort of 30 centimeters deep and ploughed away. and very ephemeral, very shallow. There's also this sort of area of enhanced magnetism there, which intrigued us. So our working hypothesis going in was that this, not knowing that the smaller enclosure was early medieval, was that this could be something sort of Iron Age prehistoric type, which it might be. It's hard to say, but certainly what we can say is this ditch has not been ploughed away. It's 2.5 meters wide, 1.5 meters deep, rock cut V-shaped ditch. We've not lost it due to ploughing. I very much doubt. So I think it is going to be genuinely incomplete, but we will investigate that further. It's a curious feature. It didn't yield anything I would want to date. And in fact, it has a very curious fill. Nothing which you could describe as a good primary fill, something which has washed in when the ditch has been open for a long period of time, a sort of organic-y primary fill. It has been backfilled with the material from the bank, I suspect, almost immediately after it was constructed. The lower fill was almost completely solid rock with large voids, air voids between them. The material had gone back into that ditch at a high speed. And then there's a slower stabilization, and then the tertiary fills are let's see if I can turn the lights down. You see better? Is that better? The tertiary fills have come in at much slower speed. So it's a curious thing. No convincing recuts. I know Tudor tried to find some, but I'm not convinced. So it appears to be something which has been constructed and then almost immediately gone out of use, which may explain why it's incomplete. And it does beg the question, what is its relationship to the smaller inner enclosure? If they are contemporary, then this is something not often encountered in Welsh archaeology. Trenches 3 and 4 were positioned over what we sort of call the Eastern complex. This frustratingly only half seen complex of linear features, some dipolar features, strongly enhanced magnetic features, one of which was in the terminal of one of the ditches. So we had wondered whether that might be because some goodies had been deposited in the terminal of the ditch, and wanted to see what that might be. These extend to the field to the east, but there's a lot going on here. So again, very small scale, limited excavation to try to determine what's there, what does it look like, what could we do going forward. This is trench 3, which is the one positioned up here, where there's a gully and appears to be an enclosure ditch. Not overly exciting, but both were seen in the archaeology. The gully there, just cut down from the bedrock, an enclosure ditch here, nice bit of excavation from the students. Shallow, flat-bottomed ditch, possibly quite heavily plough truncated. Very few finds, just tiny scraps of animal bone, not very much pottery or anything like that. But interestingly, and we should be conscious of the fact that these are small trenches, small number of sections, but the shallow ditch appears that the bank was on the outside, on the west. The material has slumped in from the side it curves away from, which is a little curious. That's cropped up in as I was looking at the section drawings the other night. Trench 4 was positioned over the terminal of that shallow flat-bottomed ditch, and you can see it coming through section. You can't see my mouse. No, it comes through at the top there, comes through section, and you can see the spoiled heap of the trench 3 beyond there. But it wasn't anything deposited within the terminal of the ditch that had created the high magnetic response in the geophysics. It was a corn drying kiln that had been cut into the terminal of the ditch. So here we have a stratigraphic sequence. We've got the earlier flat bottom ditch into which a quite impressively constructed stone-lined corn drying kiln had been placed. So we can see we've got the stone lining around the outside of the lower fire pit with the shallower drying area at the top, possibly with a step down into the fire pit as well. And the base of this had a nice thick black burnt layer, which we've sieved and produced about 0.5 kilogram of cereal grain, which is currently with a specialist for identification, and the samples off for radiocarbon dating as well. So a very nice feature, currently undated, but we'll look at some dated parallels in a moment, and I think we might be able to come up with a suggestion. Also in this trench were a couple of fairly amorphous, shallow cut features producing some animal bone, but not much else, irregular. We're going to have to open up bigger areas to understand those. But if we look at our corn drying kiln here in a moment, here are some local parallels. And thank you to Rhiannon and Como for pointing some of these out, and to the Davis as well. So here, Atlantic Trading Estate Barry, excavation from the 1980s, shallow scoop at one end, the deeper fire chamber to the other with stone lining. This one produced a radiocarbon date of 1019 to 1212 at 95%, but it's an old date. It's a radiometric date on a bulk sample, so I wouldn't put too much weight on it. I'd be more inclined to believe the date from the St. Athan Road scheme. Again, morphologically, doesn't show very nicely in this photograph, but deeper pit with in situ burning, and then a shallower drying area at the end. This is 5 Mile Lane, where they've recently re-excavated the Witten Roman villa. The deeper fire pit with in situ burning, and then the shallower scoop. Another example at St. John's Well, St. Athan. Both of these are currently undated as far as I know, but I'll be very interested in when the radiocarbon dates come back. And I do suspect that probably the example we've got at Fonmon is going to resolve itself as early medieval. So, after having convinced myself I was going to have to deal with some prehistory for a couple of years, I was pleasantly surprised that we've had so much early medieval activity. Although, when we think of its location and all that sort of, I think there is a grounds for suggesting it perhaps isn't entirely unexpected. So we have an early medieval cemetery and a contemporary enclosure with rich occupation deposits. Early medieval cemeteries aren't rare in Wales, and not that common. Ones with good preservation of animal bone, of good preservation of human bone, are fairly rare. Ones which are enclosed and which have occupation deposits are quite rare and interesting. So that's quite exciting. There is then this larger, incomplete, undated outer enclosure. What is its relationship with the cemetery? In proportion and size and scale, it looks prehistoric. But it's interesting that it does seem to be situated in relation to the smaller square enclosure. So we could be looking at an early medieval date for that as well. In the eastern complex, we've got at least 2 phases of activity. This shallow ditch, potentially with a bank on the outside, which could be important, and then potentially an early medieval corn drying kiln. So I think from our very small scale, very limited evaluation, I think we've been able to determine that there is quite significant research potential here. There's a lot more to examine. We have looked at 3 of the dozen or more features that we could explore. There is a segmented ditched enclosure here, which could be geological or, you know, could be other things. So what can we say? Well, it is not wise on the basis of a bit of geophysics and limited excavation to start coming up with grand interpretations. That is not how we work as archaeologists. But we might allow ourselves a little bit of, you know, indulge ourselves a little bit. And I think it's probably fair to say that we might be looking at something a little like what are known in Ireland as cemetery settlements, or which have recently been described in Wales as multifunctional cemeteries, which are sites where we have burials and domestic activity, but interestingly, not often evidence for houses. And this is a form of site which really has only come to prominence since the Celtic Tiger boom of the sort of 2000s and 90s. And the Irish sites are typified by metalworking deposits, animal bone and crop processing and burial. And we've got all of those. And enclosure as well. Again, we also have enclosure. And often these cemetery settlements form part of larger complexes of activity, often associated with sort of estates. In terms of parallels, it's interesting to look at West Angle Bay here, which Marion Shiner drew attention to. Very small scale work here, but they were able to date a lot of the features we see. We have a settlement enclosure, a ditched enclosure, a bit bigger than our one, but sub-square, sub-rectangular, with longer, bigger ditches and a promontory fort nearby, and dates which are broadly comparable. So not a million miles from what we could potentially have. And maybe it's not overly useful to show things like this, but this is a reconstruction of one of the Irish cemetery settlements. And we've got a small cemetery enclosure with a larger outer enclosure and a couple of roundhouses in the corner. And I won't let myself speculate as to the date of the roundhouses we've got in that settlement before we dig them. But anyway, it's a sort of something to think with as we move forward. Another context, which I think we should draw attention to, is the ecclesiastical one. Llancarvan, which is the parish immediately to the north. So we are down here, just above that triangle there, just below Llancarvan, one of the three major early ecclesiastical centres of the Vale of Glamorgan, attested in the Llandaff Charters from the 8th century. And Jeremy Knight's excellent work has shown that Llancarvan and the church is just the focus of a much broader early ecclesiastical landscape. And it is interesting that the life of Caddock, early 12th century life of Caddock, describes how the monastery had 36 canons, and each of these canons had a court, had a settlement. And there was buildings and parcels of land attached to those settlements. And the life goes on to list 27 of these settlements, these courts, and they are real. Some of them can be located on the ground, or at least the place names can be located on the ground. Undoubtedly, the reason these are in the life is because the monastery is trying to protect its interests, trying to define its property in the face of Anglo-Norman encroachment. But people such as Jeremy and Thomas Charles Edwards have noted that this sort of 27 atria might preserve something of the pre-Norman organization of the monastery, and that there might have been distributed around Llancarvan settlements associated with members of the community. And again, that's another thing we might want to think with as the project evolves and moves forward. So what are we going to do going forward? Well, this is just a start. We're going to have a much longer term project here. We're going to complete the geophysical survey, fill in the gaps, and ideally expand, cover more ground. The plan is 100% excavation of the cemetery and full osteo and bioarchaeological analysis. Cardiff University has particular strengths in bioarchaeology. I would love to date every single burial, do some Bayesian modeling on that, and throw everything at it. Thorough analysis of the early medieval settlement evidence. I say settlement in inverted commas. Zooarchaeology, paleoenvironmental, archaeometallurgical analysis. Very rarely do we come across decent stratified early medieval assemblages. So that's not waste this opportunity. Not going to be able to do this on my own. So I'm roping in Tudor Davis, who sat at the back, will be coming on board as co-director. And Oliver Davis, my colleague at Cardiff, I'm hoping to be able to offload much of the prehistory onto him. So I won't have to get too distracted by that. And ultimately what we want to try and do is place Fonmon within its regional and national context from prehistory to medieval. Tell the story on a big scale. And around that program of research and post-excavation, we hope to build in some outreach and engagement activities, particularly working with local schools, and then think about how we can also build a long-term legacy for this work, and how we can feed into the history of and the story of the castle. So, final thing, we're going back next summer. So the plan is much bigger area, open area excavation, going back with a much bigger team of students. It's going to take about 23, 25 students out. Excavate, ideally try to define the southern, eastern and northern limits of the cemetery, and heavily sample the ditches from that enclosure. Try and get some dating evidence from the large incomplete ditch. 100% become certain that it is incomplete, and then really basically just extend and expand. And what we will do over the next 5 years is basically work out from here. Characterize, fully understand the early medieval activity, but dig enough of everything else that we can tell the complete story, that we can be sure about dates and have some idea of function. It's hard to do Welsh archaeology because it doesn't yield finds very easily. So we do have to hit things hard and hit it at scale. So that's the plan for the summer. If anyone wants to come along, very welcome. I'll leave it at that, but I would just like to thank Nigel and Catherine and Ross, Chris, who started it off really, and all the Fonmon team, particularly Alan, who put up with me, and the students, and David Curtis. They have made us feel so much at home and feel part of the kind of Fonmon family, and we really do appreciate that. Thank you to the Canterbury Christchurch University students. I calculated that they walked 150 miles to do the geophysical survey, all because I was too tight to hire a quad. Thank you to the Cardiff students who worked very hard in the summer, Cambrian Archaeological Association who funded radiocarbon dates, and to the Alan, Leo, other people who contributed to the project and have made it such a success thus far. So I shall leave it at that. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Andy. That was fascinating, and this is clearly a site we're going to hear more about over the next few years. I can feel that in my bones. I want to open to questions. Just we've got people online as well as in the room. We don't have a traveling mic, so if you want to ask a question, if you could ask it, I will then summarize, repeat it into the mic so that people online can help it. If there are people online who wish to ask questions, if they type them in, Annabelle will then relay them to us. So can I sort of take chair's prerogative? And ask, I'm a great fan of large-scale geophysics, and it's very interesting to see your results coming through. I wonder whether you've got any ideas about what is happening to enhance the magnetic signal within the area of your cemetery. Do you think it is just to do with the graves, or do you think we've got enhancement through organic material?
I think it's because the graves are being backfilled with there's charcoal in the backfill. There's little bits of tile and burnt clay, the odd bit of slag.
Yeah.
So I think it's that kind of anthropogenic material which has been trapped in the graves and then not distributed by the plough so much. I suspect that's what we're seeing, but it is difficult to say.
It looks to me a little bit like the stuff that's going into the grave being distributed midden material.
Yes,
Yeah. Because that in itself is very interesting. So I saw you've got some other patches of that don't have enclosure next to them. And one of the things that, for instance, John Crichton has done is to try and characterize from the magnetic signals those sorts of things, which may be very, very interesting. And it is those areas that don't have enclosures and obvious features that may be
very much
fascinating. It's a really, really good piece of geophysics. It's great. Can I open the floor for questions or comments? Please.
Mentioned very briefly bioarchaeology. Didn't say any more about it.
That's an invitation to say something more about the bioarchaeology of the female skeleton.
We haven't yet completed it, so it's still to be done. But it's interesting things with it. Extremely gracile, and the teeth have clearly been used as a tool. So the teeth are extremely worn at the front, as if it's being used to grip something or something's running through it. So it has an interesting story to tell, and I look forward to come back in 2 months and we'll be able to say.
I was interested in the stratigraphy of the ditch for the eastern enclosure, which made the cemetery. You have the two phases of cutting the ditch and the fill associated with each. I was wondering if there's any distinction between the two phases for the finds from them. And then, of course, you have another phase when the stone is thrown in, or presumably with an enclosure wall on one side. And then you finally have a phase when it's all ploughed over. But it's the two phases of the ditch which I was interested in, if there any distinction between the finds.
There is a little bit, in the sense there's less finds from the earlier phase. And the later phase is where we get the slag. It's where the little bit of iron came from, probably all or drill bit, possibly, maybe even a bolt. Has come from the upper fill. Lower fill was just animal bone and charcoal. So there is a slight, difference in character, but it's difficult to say from such a small section. We will probably try and dig the whole thing, 100% sample. And we were sieving as well, and that really made a big impact. The quantity of material we recovered.
Do you have any ideas as to when the ploughing took place, which is not obviously industrial scale mechanical ploughing, but there is a plough soil there, isn't there?
Alan's asking whether there's evidence for the date of the ploughing over the eastern enclosure area.
Difficult to say. It has been ploughed in living memory, I think, during the war, and periodically brought into cultivation. It's periodically cultivated now. No reason furrow survives, but I wouldn't necessarily expect it to. It's very, yeah, it's hard to say. I think it was, I suspect it was in part for large parts of the late Middle Ages, and may not have been ploughed as heavily as I thought in earlier than that, given that some features are truncated, but other ones are not that heavy.
Question back there.
Is the skeletal material suitable for DNA analysis?
It's a question of whether the skeletal material might produce DNA.
Feasibly, yeah, it's possible. We were able to, so we block lifted the skull and very painstakingly sieved everything from it, and we were able to identify the ossicles, the very tiny ear bones, which are used extensively in bioarchaeology. And it's certainly something which we will try and look into. Certainly on the back of fantastic work by, which I think the next lecture is Duncan Sayers' work on Anglo-Saxon DNA. This is exactly the part of early medieval Britain where we don't have very many DNA studies from. So it would be a very good part of that picture. But obviously there's big cost implications and things like that there. But maybe, hopefully.
Do we have any online? What's the dating of the pottery and tile?
If they were big enough, I would be able to say, but they are tiny, not 100% the raw pottery. There are bits which look a bit prehistoric-y, and no recognizable Roman. Edith, I know you picked up a little bit when you field walked.
If I remember, was it the rise on which the enclosure was situated?
Yeah, we picked up quite a lot of post-med, but nothing really convincing. I suspect all the pottery we've encountered is residual in secondary context.
Are there any other questions or comments? Please.
I'd just like to congratulate you on a very interesting site that, as Martin has said, will be in the future. Yeah. And in a way, any questions that I've got might be premature. But one question that would be nice to see answered is the source for charcoal in many of the deposits. It's hearth fuel related to corn drying or whatever, but is it a domestic source or is it something else? And I was your geophysics with metal detection surveys with accurate plotting of times, because that's certainly with the experience of climate law. Density of activity was really revealed through that in a spatial sense. And what
yeah, well, we've got a question about metal detecting and whether that's going to be incorporated in this strategy, and also the importance of understanding the origins of the charcoal that's coming in.
In relation to the metal detecting, definitely. In fact, that is part of the plan for our outreach, is to actually, we're working with a school where some of the children are actually involved in metal detecting. And so that is going to be, and we did actually do it last summer, and it did produce 3 spindle wells, 3 lead spindle wells, which I might show to you at some point. So yes, I mean, definitely. And yeah, we will try to do everything we can with the archaeobotanical remains. Tudor is helping us with the sampling strategy. So we're keeping everything. We're sampling intensively. The material from the corn drying kiln is currently with Mark McKerricker, who's doing an assessment on that. We're also quite interested in the sort of the slags, whether that's charcoal or coal Again, there's things we can explore through that as well. But yeah, it's a developing story.
Edith.
I was wondering, you mentioned spindle. I was wondering whether you could be sure they're spindle wells. Or they are very, very close to the coast.
Question about whether the spindle walls or net weights.
Yeah, feasibly. Yeah, they've got the right diameter for spindle wells, and there's a little bit of wear which might suggest they were used in that way. But we need to look at them they're not decorated or anything like that. We need to look at them in a bit more detail. I'm fairly confident about the conical shaped one. That's got very good parallels. The other ones are kind of bullet shaped ones, which we do encounter, but not that commonly. But yes, that is a fishing weights is another possibility. Yeah.
Well, if there are no further questions or comments, can I thank Andy again? As I say, I'm sure this is a site that's going to figure big in the research on this exceptionally important period in South Wales over the next few years. So we're grateful to you for giving us a first view, so to speak. Thank you very much indeed.